The elections are over, but candidates are hitting the streets again, this time thanking their supporters. Protests flare across China against COVID restrictions in scenes of opposition that the ruling Communist Party hasn't seen in decades. In Taipei, people show their support for the protesters in China.
I'm Andrew Ryan, and I'm in the southern Taiwan town of Hengchun, where a dedicated group of teachers, seniors, and kids are doing their best to make sure a beloved musical tradition lasts as long as these city walls.
A warm welcome to TaiwanPlus News. I'm Yin Khvat. After Saturday's local elections, candidates were out hitting the streets to show their appreciation to their supporters, and all eyes were on the winner and losers in the Taipei mayoral race, as Eric Gao reports.
Taipei Mayor-elect Zhang Wan-an spent Sunday thanking his supporters. Zhang, from the main opposition Kuomintang, won the capital's leadership race on Saturday night, claiming 42% of the vote. At 43 years old, he will be Taipei's youngest ever elected mayor. Zhang prevailed against his two main rivals, the ruling Democratic Progressive Party's Chen Sizong and independent former deputy Taipei mayor Vivian Huang. With his victory secured, attention is turning to who he will appoint to his governing team. But for now, he's remaining low-key.
我们都在规划，我想最重要的就是专心在施政的推动。
Local media have speculated that Zhang could invite Huang to return to her previous post as one of his deputies. But like Zhang, she's not making any commitments.
先卸票再说，先卸票再说吧。大家都急着帮我找工作嘛，我想清楚了就会跟大家说。台北市长蒋万安。
Zhang will be sworn in as Taipei mayor on Christmas Day. This gives him just under a month to finish thanking supporters and decide on a team. Klein Wong and Eric Gao for TaiwanPlus.
Taiwan's ruling Democratic Progressive Party had a difficult election night on Saturday, losing control of 3 northern cities and failing to win Taipei. But the results were even worse for some of the country's smallest parties, with only a handful of winners among dozens of losses. Now, as Dash Butler reports, these parties are trying to figure out why they failed to connect with the electorate.
It was a lonely victory lap for Zhang Boyang on Sunday. He and one other Taiwan state-building party candidate won their local elections the day before, gaining their party its first ever seats. But they were the exceptions. Every one of the other 22 TSP candidates lost in their respective races. Many other smaller parties were similarly met with disappointment after Saturday's local elections. In 2018, Taiwan's New Power Party won 16 councillor seats. This year, that number dropped to just 6. Lin Yukai was one of the several NPP councillors who lost their jobs.
有位置的时候，我们当然在体制内进行监督。现在没有位置了，我在体制外面还是可以跟透过社会力量的结合去行使监督的权利。
Taiwan's political landscape is dominated by the ruling Democratic Progressive Party and the main opposition, the Kuomintang. Smaller parties had hoped the recent elections would allow them to make a dent in this duopoly, but ultimately it failed to materialize. Now polling is over, smaller party candidates are trying to figure out why they failed to find their niche with voters. Claire Wang, one of the NPP's 3 national lawmakers, blamed a paralysis of decision-making at the top level of her party.
决策委员会的这段时间，不论是对于时事的争辩，又或者是对于重大议题的回应，我们往往选择一个低调回应，甚至是不回应的态度。这无疑是让我们自己把时代力量推向了边缘。
But where some failed, others succeeded. Taiwan People's Party candidate Gao Hong'an won a historic victory to become mayor of Hsinchu City. As the dust settles from Saturday's vote, Taiwan's small parties are looking back to see what went right for Gao and other successful candidates and what went wrong elsewhere. Ricky and Stash Butler for TaiwanPlus.
To find out more about what Saturday's election means for the country's politics going forward, our reporter Stash Butler spoke to Lev Nachman, a political scientist at National Zhengzhou University.
So first off, who were the big winners of Saturday's election and who were the losers?
This was a big landslide victory for the KMT in a way that I think really kind of mirrors the same kind of success that they had in 2018 Although obviously the big difference is that this wasn't so much a Han wave tied to one very controversial political candidate, but more, I think, a clear vote in dissatisfaction with the DPP, and I think a reflection of just how strong the KMT is able to pull local networks when it comes to local elections.
And does this mean, given the KMT's victory, taking Taipei, Geelong, Taoyuan, all of these northern kind of cities, is this sort of setting them on their way to taking the presidency and perhaps the legislature in 2024?
It certainly will give the KMT momentum, but it's really important to remember that a national election functions very different from a local election. Most specifically, we're going to be talking about China and cross-strait relations a whole lot more when it comes to the presidential election. And the KMT really struggles at presenting a policy platform on cross-strait politics that appeals to large swaths of Taiwanese civil society. So even though they were really successful in the local elections, that's not going to guarantee or translate into an easy 2024 victory for the party.
A lot of Taiwan's really smallest parties like the Taiwan State Building Party, the New Power Party, they fared pretty badly in these elections. Why is that?
Small parties, I think, are just really struggling to find what exactly their niche is that they're trying to fill in Taiwan. I think previously the NPP had a much more clear direction, and the Taiwan State Building Party also, at the very least, was much more clear about their attitudes and how they varied from the DPP. But I think for a lot of voters, it's very unclear why they would want to support a smaller third party in local elections versus, say, one of the two main parties.
As COVID-19 infection rates continue to decrease, Taiwan's health authorities are preparing to ease some more pandemic restrictions.
大方向来看，就是说室外就不用戴。岁末的这个大型活动的这个口罩规定，我们会再看变化，再另行研拟。但是大致上的方向就是室外或是室外空间或室外场所，那取消应全程佩戴口罩的这个相关规定。
This will take effect on Thursday, December 1st. Face masks will still be required in most indoor situations and on public transport. Authorities added that the current limit on international arrivals will be scrapped entirely on the 10th. They also announced that vaccine booster shots will soon be available to younger children. Analysts are predicting that Taiwan's GDP growth will fall below 3% next year. That's amid a slowing global economy and soaring inflation. New estimates put Taiwan's growth at between 2.3% and 2.5%. Although Taiwan's National Development Council reports that the local economy improved slightly between September and October, important indicators like industrial production and exports are still on a months-long downward trend. We turn now to China, where thousands of people are taking to the streets to oppose ongoing pandemic restrictions. China has a strict zero-COVID approach to the virus. While its cases are low compared to many other countries, they have hit record highs in recent days, with around 40,000 new infections reported on Monday. Louise Watt reports.
Mounting anger in China against strict COVID measures is morphing into a wave of opposition that the ruling Communist Party hasn't seen in decades. These protesters in Shanghai on Sunday calling for no more lockdowns. The demonstrations against China's unwavering zero-COVID approach began on Friday and have spread to other cities, including the capital Beijing, where demonstrators held up blank pieces of paper, a protest symbol against censorship.
上海已经有很多人被抓进去了，不只是昨天晚上，他们是为了大家，是为了所有人，是为了每一个骑手不被封在家里，为了大家能够吃上药，能够吃上饭。我们应该声援这些更勇敢的人。上海放人！上海放人！
protests have also spread to dozens of universities. In Beijing, these students called for democracy and the rule of law and freedom of speech. Public anger has grown as 3 years into the COVID-19 pandemic, China continues its policy of trying to stamp out all trace of the virus. And that has meant mass lockdowns and daily testing of millions of people. One trigger was a fire last week that killed 10 people in an apartment building in Urumqi in the Xinjiang region, where some had been locked in their homes for 4 months. Online questions were raised whether these restrictions had stopped people escaping. China's economy has also been suffering, a point made by protesters confronting police. Throughout the pandemic, the Chinese government has told its people strict restrictions are necessary to keep them safe. But as they watch the World Cup and see spectators packed together, not wearing masks, they have increasingly questioned what the government has been telling them. Police have been detaining people, but authorities are struggling to put down these protests. This is a very different China than that portrayed at the Communist Party conference last month, when President Xi Jinping was anointed for an unprecedented third term, seemingly making him the most powerful Chinese leader in decades. Now, discontent over his strict COVID policies is leading to demonstrations of anger, unfamiliar manifestations openly challenging his rule. Patrick Chen and Louise Watt for TaiwanPlus.
The anti-lockdown protests, which have spread across China, have now morphed into demands for wide-sweeping political reform. To extend their solidarity across the Taiwan Strait, people in Taipei gathered for a vigil on Sunday. Ryan Patrick was there.
The words of a lone Beijing protester who dared to defy Chinese leader Xi Jinping's consolidation of power last month. Now, those sentiments ring across Liberty Square in Taiwan's capital. This vigil was organized to mourn the loss of life in the Chinese city of Urumqi, where a fire is believed to have killed 10 people confined to their homes amid a COVID-19 lockdown. It's also a show of solidarity for the anti-lockdown protesters that have taken to the streets across China. Survivors of the Tiananmen Square crackdown in 1989 were among the attendees of Sunday's vigil.
33年来，我们89一代第一次看到中国民主自由的火焰，通过一个一个行动起来的年轻人，在全世界燃烧。
Hong Kong exiles and students from across the strait also gathered around the candlelight. Though she was willing to be interviewed, this student from northern China asked not to be identified, out of fear of repercussions for herself and her family.
一阵子之前，中国防疫政策加剧之后，很多人在风控之中上升。国内也会有很多反对的声音，之后我就一直算是还蛮关注这件事情的。
In spite of her concern for what might happen to the movement and its supporters, she says she continues to hold onto a sense of hope.
我当然首先是很敬佩他们的行动，因为我知道在国内抗疫的后果有多么的大，这样子。我不知道未来会发生什么，但我希望他们一切都好。
As protests in China grow, they're sparking new hope for change, not only throughout China, but also across the sea. Ryan Kilpatrick for TaiwanPlus.
For more on the protests spreading across China, Ryan Kilpatrick spoke with Human Rights Watch senior China researcher Yaqiu Wang.
Over the past few days, a lot of people have been comparing these protests erupting across China to the Hong Kong protests, for example, and also to 1989. They say it's the biggest protest movement they've seen on the streets of mainland China for decades. How significant do you think they are?
It's very significant because we haven't seen the kind of protests in the sense that people were demanding democracy, demanding the end of the CCP rule. This is very, very unusual. protests with specific demands concerning specific livelihood issues, like pollution, like housing issues, happens periodically in China, but not the kind of that outright saying down with CCP. This is first. Second is that this is across the country. Protests in China usually are confined in one location on a specific issue. But this time it's, in Shanghai, in Beijing, in Wuhan, in Hangzhou, in Nanjing. And people all linking this unreasonable, abusive, unscientific COVID response to the political system.
As you point out, people in China have been living under these zero COVID restrictions for nearly a few years now. Why do you think that these frustrations have erupted so suddenly at this point?
The pent-up anger and frustration have been stewing for 3 years. We all have emotional outbursts. I think, then there's one person who courageously, stand up and said, down with the CCP. Then it resonates with so many people. So people start to chant together. That's how protests happen. That's how movements happen. That's how revolutions happen. It's all spontaneous.
Looking at the past and what have happened to previous movements like this in China, what do you think is going to happen?
I feel very inspired. I also know the history of how brutal the government can go to suppress protests. The ability for people to organize in a sustainable way is really hampered by the government's continuous tighten up repression in the past 10 years. So people can have individual anger and they go to the street out of frustration, a burst of courage. But in order for any movement to sustain, there needs to be organized efforts, and that is very hard to sustain in China.
New images have emerged of Japanese and British armed forces conducting joint defense exercises. The drills are taking place in Japan and are focused on bolstering island defense abilities. Chinook helicopters from Japan transported dozens of British troops as part of a simulated island offensive. The exercises are the first the countries have held together in 4 years and are scheduled to continue until the end of November. Back in Taiwan's main international airport in Taoyuan, which is actively recruiting staff to accommodate a recent surge in travellers. This increase follows Taiwan's relaxation of COVID-19 border restrictions. According to the country's transportation ministry, over 90,000 people visited Taiwan in October after the limit on arrivals was lifted. That's a 560% jump from the same month in 2021. However, the tourist wave could overwhelm airport staff, whose numbers fell sharply during the pandemic. The airport has opened a recruitment portal on its website. Job openings include everything from check-in staff to food service workers to aircraft maintenance technicians. But filling some of those positions may be more difficult than others.
维修人员那是比较专业性的，然后在其他职缺可能也许不是那么替代性那么普遍，那销售人员他其实是不一样的选择，其实很多。
Now, how can you compete with TV and video games if you're trying to get children interested in a dying art form? Well, the people of Hongtun at the southernmost tip of Taiwan have come up with some unique ways to preserve their local heritage. TaiwanPlus sent a team there to learn more.
Zhang Rugui is playing the moon-shaped lute, also known as the yueqin, for an audience of 4. This is a Hengchun folk ballad, a traditional form of music named after the southernmost tip of Taiwan. It's a relatively isolated part of the country, a place where indigenous melodies and language have mixed with Hakka and Hokkien elements to create a musical tradition found nowhere else in the world. The songs are deeply rooted in daily life. The lyrics express the difficulties of rural living and a longing for home.
五百
People like Zhang Rugui have been working hard to pass on these songs to the next generation. She's been doing it right in her front yard for decades. But there are fewer and fewer people left who remember these folk ballads.
歌谣传统是务必要失传的，因为会唱的人都是老人嘛，或是大人，那他们总有一天会离开这人世间嘛。我们找到最后一块拼图，就在孩子。
Local schools have been teaching Hengchuan folk music for decades. But the real turning point came in 2014 when they enshrined it in the curriculum. Now every child who goes to school here spends 10 years hearing and singing the music from the time they enter preschool until they graduate from primary school.
所以我们想尽办法让它有趣、生活、潜移默化。那如果能够把这样的歌谣的元素加进流行歌曲，趣味化就产生了。那潜移默化就是说，我们把它加入他平常的游戏当中，渐渐的就会把这样的元素放进他们的学习，放进他们的生活里面。那他不知不觉就会在传承文化。
Today, the children are practicing for the Hengchuan Folk Music Contest, which is in its 15th year.
非常喜欢，恒春这种调子也挺好听的呀。我平常快乐的时候心情很好，我就会唱这个歌。
Down the road at Hengchuan Elementary School's Nanwan branch, the whole school, that's 22 students and 11 faculty, they're practicing traditional wedding songs for the group competition. In the voice of one fifth grader, you can hear a sound that belies his age. It's the distinctive cries of a mother giving away her daughter to be married. It's a sound that's unmistakably connected to this place and the people who live here. The sound of Hengchuan, the sound of home. When the big day arrives, the city of Hengchuan is buzzing with excitement. Hundreds of people from local villages have come to showcase their talents. There are a lot of nervous children here today waiting their turn on stage, which is actually a traditional bench set up in front of the old city walls. Now, people have been sitting on these traditional benches to sing folk songs for ages, but usually it's older people singing the songs. Today, it's all kids. In the end, the students and teachers of Hengchuan Elementary School's Nanwan branch are awarded honors for their performance. But it's not really about the prize. The local teachers are hoping to give the children something much, much bigger.
其实我们要的就是说，孩子能够种下一颗内心的种子，让他离开这个故乡之后，还记得回来这个故乡。孩子可以离开故乡，但是故乡不会离开他。 借由这个能够创造他的认同感跟光荣感，我想孩子们永远都不会背弃故乡这样子。
Every year, droves of people do come home to Hengchuan, drawn by the sounds of the local ballads. Thousands attend the annual Hengchuan Folk Music Festival. And from the size of the stage and the energy of the crowd, you could be excused for thinking they've come to see pop stars perform. The people of Hengchuan have long used music as a way of telling the stories of their windswept peninsula. The fact that these songs have survived through the ages is a testament not just to the music itself, but to the people who share it, hoping to plant a seed, a constant reminder of this place they call home. Thomas Xu, Alex Chen, Peachy Drong, and Andrew Ryan for TaiwanPlus.
People in Taiwan are eating less rice than they did 10 years ago, with wheat and potatoes catching up with the nation's favorite staple. New figures reveal the average person in Taiwan ate 43 kilos of rice in 2021. That's down 2.5 kilos from 2012. Wheat consumption rose over the same period to a new high of 38 kilos per person. Potatoes have become more popular too. So what's behind the swing? Taiwan's agriculture agency cited a trend of westernization in the national diet, including an explosion of Western-style bakeries. Then there's the pandemic theory. COVID habits led to fewer people eating communal meals, where rice would be the normal side dish. Whatever the cause, it's clear Taiwanese tastes are changing over time. Thank you for watching TaiwanPlus News. Remember to download the TaiwanPlus app for more stories from Taiwan and around the world. Finally today, we leave you with images of the Christmas market in Estonia's capital city of Tallinn. I'm Yin Khvat. Take care and see you next time.